good afternoon or good noon. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Alice Velková from the Department for Demography and Geodemography of Faculty and Science. And first of all, I'm happy to invite our special guest, Therese Garstenauer, and of course, I would like to invite all of you, both you in person here in this room and also our online guests. This today event is organized within the project Social Mobility of Elites. And I would like to use this opportunity to announce that we have launched the project website. You can see here the address of the websites. So I don't want to speak about the project because you can read the information here. And I would just like to emphasize that one of our aims was to provide information about other researchers related to elites. So don't hesitate to send us such information, and we will happy to share them, to publish them on the website. Here is a special chapter here, and you can find here the information about running project and to connection to its their websites. So now let's move to the main point of today. I believe that Dr. Therese Garstenauer is well known to you, so I introduce her only briefly. Her home institution is the University of Vienna, more precisely Department of Social and Economic History. However, she came from Hradec Králové today or yesterday because she is visiting professor this semester there, and she participated in several projects. For example, in a research project, The Great Transformation, State and Communal Civil Service in Vienna, 1918 to 1920. And I can show you one of the results of the project. The book, and we are happy because we have 3 contributors directly in this room, and I think that in online milieu also some of them. So I am looking forward to the very interesting discussion. Could I ask you, Martin, to send the book? And the topic of Therese Garstenauer's current project is Austrian public employees and conduct of life. Her aim is to write a social, cultural, political, and administrative history of Austrian government employees with a special focus on the conduct of life. Her today's lecture is connected to this latest research, so I won't keep you any longer. Therese, the floor is yours.
Thanks again, Alice, for this kind introduction and for the invitation. I understand that I'm talking to some extent to demographers today who will maybe be irritated because my approach is more on the cultural side, and I will also treat you to some feminist historical research, whereas others might know a lot more about civil service than I do and will be bored. But just bear with me, and yeah, I look forward to sharing this with you. I'll start with a little anecdote. One estimated senior colleague of mine a few years ago, when we presented a joint presentation, said, well, if we are talking about civil servants in the 1920s, 1930s, forget about this gendered language and stars and stuff, because there were practically no women. But that's just not correct, because even in the early 1920s, there were about 10% based on official statistics, albeit in subaltern positions. And also, I think gender is not to do with women only. I think that when you're dealing with norms, values, and practices of civil service and civil servants, that prompts to have a good look at ideas of masculinity is also manifested in this field. So, investigating the proper conduct of life of Austrian government employees, standesgemäße Lebensführung, very hard to translate, the German term, between 1918 and 1914, which, as Alicia said, is my habilitation project. I've learned that gender and family issues are really a crucial point here. And my focus is on the professional life as well as the private life of public employees, since these two spheres are closely connected, and that's even based in the service law, as you will see. Public employees, namely, had to behave in service and in private life in a manner that would not compromise the honor of the authorities and also of the state. And such proper behavior often had to do with gender norms, such that existed and such that were being refashioned at the time. Now, as for the structure of my lecture, I would like to begin with a few words about the emergence of modern civil service and its gendered aspects. I will talk briefly about Karin Hausen's paper on the character of the sexes. It's an important reference, although it's over 40 years old, but I think it's still relevant. All the more so since that dissociation of gainful employment and family life that she observes in the course of the 18th, 19th century was relevant, especially for the bourgeois strata of society, and among them, in particular, civil servants' families. I will then show how women got into Cisleithanian civil service from the 1860s onward. Then I will present you a brief statistical portrait of Austrian civil servants of 1923. It's a little treat for the demographers, maybe, because there will be some data on marital status, children, and so on. Then follow a few remarks on disciplinary files, which are a favorite source of mine. Then I will say something about Joan Wallach Scott's concept of gender and how I'm using it when approaching the source material. And finally, I will look at 4 parts of this gender concept of Scott's, namely symbols, social norms, social institutions and organizations, and also subjective identity. So that's about it. Civil servants in a broad sense have existed for thousands of years. If you think of persons in very broad sense, performing tasks such as clerical work, auditing, accounting, tax collection, advising the ruler, judicial activities, policing, and other public tasks for a ruler or for some political administrative unit. Think of ancient Egypt and China. But although we can find some aspects of modern civil service also in these ancient cultures, it would be anachronistic to look for parallels or draw some direct genealogies. That doesn't make so much sense. If we are talking about modern, Western, predominantly European civil service, it makes more sense to look at the historical development from service to medieval princes to modern public service, as for instance, Jos Ratschelders and Mark Rutgers have described it in the history of civil service. Service, as a special type of earning one's livelihood, is characterized by a personal involvement that may be traced back to this tradition of belonging to a feudal household. The relation between civil servants and the state is, there's a chat message, maybe somebody.
No, it's written by Clara.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, so because sometimes somebody doesn't hear us. So okay, where was I now? Okay, the relation between the civil servants and the state is a peculiar one, and I would like to illustrate this older understanding with a quote by Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, who's called the Soldier King, first half of the 18th century. And he said about his administrative stuff, one must serve the master with life and limb, with Leib und Leben, that's in German, with goods and chattels, with honor and conscience, and employ everything except the soul, which belongs to God, but anything else must be mine. So this is a not so modern understanding, but the tradition still goes on. Okay, and the German historian Otto Hinze cites yet another tradition that's crucial for modern civil service. That's the tradition of hired doctors that were jurists whose specialized services were called upon only temporarily. So you can see it's a mixture of loyalty on the one hand and competence on the other, ideally. And the livelihood, hang on, that's not yet, of a civil servant is also not understood as merely an exchange of money against work, but more like the civil servant places himself. Well, at this time we can speak of himself. There were really no women. His whole person at the disposal of the employer. He's appointed and swears an oath of allegiance. The appointment is a one-sided thing, not a contract between two parts. Yeah, and the civil servant is obliged to live up to the standards of honor of his function in all realms of his life. And the employer's duty for his part is to care for the civil servant, which stipulates that the employer is in charge of fending for the civil servant and his dependents, allowing him to lead a life according to his status. Again, standesgemäß, very hard to translate. So summing up, civil servants are a peculiar social professional group for whom the service law stipulates a closer connection between private and professional lives than for others. Okay, that's the prehistory. Now we're getting closer to modern civil service. Towards the end of the 18th century, the profession of civil servants began to change. That's a phenomenon that can be observed in various European states. In the Habsburg Empire, it was Empress Maria Theresa and notably her son and successor Joseph II, who expanded the state administration and initiated steps towards a more modern relationship between the state, the emperor, and the employees. Joseph II himself fashioned himself as the first civil servant of the state, as it were, and expected the same as a similar devotion towards service and self-sacrifice, an enlightened mind, and a burning interest for the needs of the state, of the government employees. The number of civil servants was also growing considerably under his regime, and some important changes were introduced. For instance, entry exams and definitions of what training and education was required for a position. The service accommodations at court were abolished. So keep this in mind for the separation of workplace and family. Remuneration, that is what people were paid, was installed predominantly in money and on a regular basis to replace the system of perquisites, that is money collected from citizens for singular official acts. That means it should be organized in a way that could keep civil servants away from getting corrupted for asking for more money, maybe because they needed it. Okay. The principle of seniority meant that civil servants became promoted after a certain time they spent in service. So you had something like a plannable career. Old age pensions were introduced as a mechanism or something, an entitlement and not a mercy, and also maintenance for widows and orphans of civil servants. But all of this, this was only the beginning of it. You must not expect that these pensions were sufficient or anything, but it was a start. Okay. Lifelong tenure, Pragmatisierung, as Austrian legalese has it, that's another characteristic trait of modern civil service, was introduced a bit later after Joseph II in the first decades of the 19th century. And that implied that the employment relation could only be terminated either when the civil servant wished for this himself, or in case of massive misdemeanor. Then there were disciplinary procedures or something else, and the person was dismissed. So, despite all these developments, we must also keep in mind that not all persons serving the state in the 19th century were civil servants proper. On the contrary, most of them were clerks, trainees, so-called Diwanisten. These were people who were only employed on a daily basis, and they were outside the already developed rank system of civil servants. And there was also the category of the servants, Diener. They were more similar to civil servants, but not tenured and not entitled to a pension, and also without the right to suffrage and right of domicile, the Heimatrecht, and other fringe benefits that were that civil servants proper received. So just to give you an idea, only the blue part, that's about a fifth, at least around the end of this period in the late 1840s, was really consisted of real civil servants. Diener servants made up the biggest part, and there were also the trainees that often worked for little or no money at all, in hope of later becoming civil servants proper, which meant that you needed to have means or a supportive family to afford a possible career in civil service. So, right. In the last third of the 19th century, many associations of civil servants formed, mostly among the subaltern groups, and they put petition for more rights and better conditions of service. In 1865, the first General Association of Civil Servants was formed. It included also employees in the private sector, in banks, and so on. And one of their most important achievements of the was a comprehensive service law of January 1914, the Dienstpragmatik. We come back to it later. Yeah, here's a little overview of the structure of public employees in 1912. And sorry, the third of below, Wachkorps, I have not managed to translate. These are some sort of gendarmes or watchmen persons. And what you can see here is the civil servants proper are still not the biggest group. This is the first line with the teachers and judges also. You see a huge group of railway employees with the development of these technologies and the nationalization, a new type of mass civil servants that was also more similar to workers as a group that tended more to organize and were always viewed with much suspicion from persons in power, because they did not fit into the Josephinist ideals quite right. Okay. So before we get to the end of the monarchy, now let's take a step back again and take a look at the process of separation of workplace and home, or professional and private lives. And as I said, this process can be observed in the period between about 1780 and 1848, what has been called Sattelzeit, settled time by Reinhard Koselleck, as some of you may know, a time of important societal and economic changes. And social historian Karin Hausen has conducted remarkable research on this, discovering the characters of the sexes. So in the course of the 18th century, a new understanding or new understandings of the differences between the sexes developed, as one can glean from contemporary encyclopedias, dictionaries, philosophical writings, etiquette guides, and others. And whereas in the first half of the 18th century and earlier, the sexes were described more by their social status and what they were doing, what were their tasks, what was their position in the household. Now these differences between men and women were explained as character traits, as their nature, something inherent to a person, and maybe similar to what today is sold under men are from Mars and women from Venus. Yes, but along with this, there was also a social division of labor between the sexes that changed, at least in some strata of the society. And here I quote Karin Hausen, who said that this polarization of the sexes, as she calls it, coincided with real social phenomena in the educated bourgeoisie, because just because it is in some books, that doesn't mean that all of society buys it, but those parts of society certainly did. And as you can see in the second quote that I won't read to you in all detail, she connects this with the development of the bureaucracy, with the regular salaries, with the offices that are no longer part of the house, with the pension systems and so on. And importantly, she says, consumption and production are divorced, and getting means for the household becomes the task of the male breadwinner. So that is that. A man became the sole breadwinner. His income should ideally, of course, it doesn't mean it always did, allow for maintaining a whole family. And in the 19th century, civil servants wanting to get married had to prove to the authorities that they had a sufficient income or other assets, and/or other assets. Also, dependent family members were also provided for if the head of the family died or was too sick to earn his living. But this gender order was called into question as more and more women entered state service themselves. That brings us to the next part of the lecture, which is about how women got into state service. So Karin Hausen has shown how this polarization of the characters of the sexes took place, parallel to a dissociation of gainful employment on the one hand, family life on the other. And families were manifesting this breadwinner, homemaker model, but what if there wasn't a breadwinner because a woman did not get married for whatever reason? Or what if the widow's or orphan's pension was not sufficient? And that was often the case. And it is precisely at this point that women were admitted to state employment. The access started with a certain type of rural post offices that were not fully state post offices, but had a state license. They were called nicht-ärarische Postämter. Ärarisch means pertaining to the state finances, and nicht-ärarisch is non-ärarian. Well, you know what I mean. And they were often organized then as family business, more like a early modern household or something like this. And a decree of April 1869 allowed for women to train and work as postal servants in these rural offices. And they could even become postmaster. And what is interesting, whereas in other parts of state employment, women had to quit service if they got married, those nicht-ärarische postal servants could be married and still keep on pursuing gainful employment. By the end of this year, 1869, women were also admitted to work in state postal and telegraph services. And it was around 1900 that the rural postal services were reformed, and from then on they were also state employed. As for women working in the telegraph services, this was mainly introduced because they could be paid less than their male colleagues. These female telegraph workers were on the same level as the Dionisten I mentioned before. They were paid on a daily basis and only for the days they were there. But the other argument for admitting them was really to fend for daughters and widows of civil servants. And they were prioritized in for getting hired there. So one could kill two birds with one stone, as the saying goes. And now I'll show you some numbers. First, in form of a table. So this is the first column is the nicht-ärarische, then the state post and telegraph services, then the railways a bit later, post office savings banks, police headquarters, and for some reason the Office of Commercial Statistics. Here you can see in form of a graph that there was a considerable growth from just 170 roughly only in the non-state rural post offices to around 9,000 in 1900. In the years following the turn of the century, women were also admitted to clerical position in ministries and other authorities, offices of fiscal and district authorities. And we see quite an increase in the postal and telegraph services in the mid-1890s due to the nationalization of telephone services. In 1872, just a few years after the beginning of the admission, women made up about 5% of postal and telegraph employees, and in 1900 already 27%. That is more than a quarter. What kind of work did they do? Briefly, they did work for which there was no specialized training, or just very little. We must keep in mind that women could not attend high schools until the 1890s and were admitted to university studies only in 1897, and that was just for the humanities. Legal studies could be conducted by women only from 1919 onwards, and that of course included them for getting to higher ranks of civil service. The work was often monotonous and also physically exhausting. For example, working with telegraph apparatuses was heavy work, or work with the telephone. Payment for female employees was lower in the most occupational settings, which was explained with the marital status, because single persons had lower living expenses, and only single and widowed women without children could be employed. Men, for their part, were potential breadwinners and required thus higher wages. Women were, in most cases, not civil servants proper in the late monarchy, as a rule. Yes, as I said, most women were initially employed in postal and telegraph services, and already around the turn of the century, there were several associations of postal workers who had their own journals. And speaking about the breadwinner model, I give you one remarkable, but not unity. There were several statements of that kind. She said, Lucy Greipel was a postmaster, and she said at work there's no distinction made whether it's done by a man or a woman, and there should be equal remuneration, because the time in which man was considered the sole breadwinner of the family have passed. In our circles, only a few families are so well off that they can do without the additional earnings of a woman. Now, of course, she speaks of additional earnings, but still the breadwinner model is challenged. Right, with this quote from the year 1913, we are already in a very late phase of the Habsburg monarchy, and it was in January 1914, half a year before World War I, broke out, that the Dienstpragmatik, the service law, became effective. It was a truly comprehensive modern service law, and by the way, it has been operative until the 1970s in Austria, with the exception of the National Socialist era, of course. Yes, and at the same day, another decree became effective, which pertained to the personnel in state authorities that were not civil servants proper. They were called Kanzleihilfspersonal, clerical personnel, if you will. And it included some regulations that were rather discriminatory against women. Again, only unmarried, divorced, or widowed women without children could be employed in such service. This changed only in the Republic in 1919, a law called Pragmatisierungsgesetz, was decreed, which stipulated finally equal pay for equal work, irrespective of sex. Of course, you can imagine that there was a lot of vertical and horizontal segregation, but still. Now, one might think that after all these legal achievements, culminating in a modern service law and equal rights for men and women, equal pay, and so on, civil servants would be able to serve the state under quite favorable conditions. Yes, that might have been the case, but some historical events interfered. World War I and the following years, for instance, were plagued by a high inflation. And for persons with a fixed income, that means that the income lost value. And despite many efforts mitigating this problem with additional payments, like that were called Teuerungszulagen, like inflation payments, civil servants suffered an economic and social decline in this era, and retired civil servants were particularly affected. Now, the new state and its strikingly decreased territory prompted a reduction of personnel in civil service. In 1922, the League of Nations agreed on granting Austria a loan that was really sorely needed by this ailing state. And one of the conditions for this loan was to downsize the state apparatus. And through the years 1922 to 25, almost 100,000 of about 250 civil servants were laid off or forcibly pensioned. There are several documentation about how many civil servants were dismissed, laid off in various places, but they are not itemized by gender. I only have sources, complaints by women's associations of the 1920s and 30s that say that women have been particularly affected, again with the argument that women are not heads of households and can therefore be more easily dismissed. Okay, yes. Summing up, the interwar period brought about several economic and also political developments. I'm not going on about these now, that proved difficult for civil servants and certainly not very encouraging for female participation. But when you compare the occupational censuses of 1910 and 1934, you still find some increase of the women's share of this socio-professional group. So that is that. I will now get to the socio-demographic portrait of Austrian government employees in the early First Republic that I promised. Yeah, I'll show you how it looked like in terms of age, family status, and number of children. Detailed information on civil servants was rarely publicized in the interwar period, with the exception of one Beamtenstatistik of September 1923, published a year later in the Statistischen Nachrichten. So what you see here is the age distribution with the Administration General, Post and Telegraph Services, Federal Railways, and Südbahn, that is a private railway company that was nationalized only in 1923. Okay, what you see here is a strong representation of persons in their 20s and a notable decline beginning with those a bit over 40 years of age. And this tendency is most visible for the personnel of the general administration and the railways, less so with employees of post and telegraph services and Südbahn railways. And to some extent, these figures, I think, reflect already the initial effects of the massive layoffs of government employees in the 1920s, particularly with regard to the older cohorts. The high proportion of young personnel may be due to the fact that while limits on the number of new entries were already put into place in 1918, employment was still possible. Right. In terms of gender ratio, the statistics show that the percentage of women in public employment amounted to about 10% of the workforce. And as for marital status, I think that's very interesting. There's a certain pattern that still shows this marriage ban that was no longer the jure the case. It had been abandoned in 1919, but you can still see its opposite trend most of the women are unmarried, most of the men are married. Right. We also have numbers about public employees and the number of their children, but only those who were not working under collective bargaining agreements. That is mostly the persons who were working in public enterprises. So it's not the same database, but still we see some kind of a trend that of those who had children, about 44, that's 44% of the employees. Or if you only take the married ones, it's 61% or so. But what you can see here is that almost half of them had one child, almost a third of them had two children, and three and more children were less common. And several contemporary newspaper articles expressed worries about the declining numbers of children in Austrian families in general, but also in civil servants' families. And these numbers also point to the fact that the higher the position of a government employee, the fewer children they tended to have. Well, not these numbers because they are not itemized by status, but there are other publications. For instance, in the 1920s in Upper Austria, the average number of children in a road mender's family was a bit over 4, whereas grammar school teachers had 1.4 children on average. The author of this newspaper article states these numbers or relations are fairly similar to those before World War I. Unfortunately, he does not quote the sources. But a small survey of 1936 of an office in the Vienna city administration showed that 80 employees questioned, 8 of them were unmarried, 40 were married without children, 23 married with 1 child, 7 with 2 children, and only 1 had 3 children. So the numbers are in line with observations made, for instance, by Josef Ehmer, that the educated middle classes, including civil servants, were among the first to use birth control in some way or other. The prospect of a plannable career may have furthered the ideas and practice of planning the number of children. Okay, so much about this little portrait. Now I will say a few things about disciplinary files. According to the service law of 1914, they already mentioned Dienstpragmatik, Austrian public employees had to behave in and outside service in a manner that did not harm the reputation of the state. And if they did not, disciplinary procedures could be initiated, conducted by commissions made up of senior officials of the authority in which the misdemeanor had happened. The service law included clear regulations of the procedures in the case of such a disciplinary offense, but did not specify what exactly amounted to such a disciplinary offense. So it could be anything from not finishing your files, being too rude to somebody approaching the authorities, being not giving him enough respect to your superiors, but also being drunk in public, having affairs, making excessive debts and stuff like this. This is really a very broad range of things. And the vagueness of the employment code turned out to be very convenient for the purposes of my research, because you have here negotiations of the borders of what is decent, what is indecent, how bad is an offense, and what punishment should it get. So these members of the commission discussed and decided whether a disciplinary procedure should take place at all, what had happened, what was the person like at all, and what to do about it. In some instances, the person accused also protested against the indictment. Yes. And also sometimes you have statements of witnesses. So it's a very interesting source for social history. And I will later give some examples from such files and other sources. So now we come to the concept of gender according to Joan W. Scott. The historians among you may have heard about this. This is from the 1980s, but I think it's a rather a handy way of constructing what this gender thing is about. She says it's a concept that consists of two parts. One is states that gender is a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes, and this part has four subsets, namely symbols that are available and have meaning at a certain time and place, normative concept in a society, politics and social institutions and organizations, and then subjective identity. And these subsets are interrelated. The second part is, she says, gender is the primary way of signifying relationships of power, and she asks these three questions: how are gender differences and the distribution of power put into relation to one another? How are these relations legitimized? And also, how can these relationships change? And now, for the sake of my approach to sources, I concentrate on the first part. Yes, and I will begin with looking at symbols that play a role in this context. Some of you, maybe Vlad, has already met the lady on the left. That's the Austria in the Austrian Ministry of Public Service and Sports, the Hohenstaufengasse. It's a marble and bronze statue of 1880s, and it's an allegory of Austria. So it's, yeah, she's rather martially clothed, but it's a female representation of the state. But I think it's rather an exception. And I think a more powerful and definitely male symbol is Emperor Joseph II, of whom I already spoke. And as you can see in this portrait, it's not the typical portrait of an emperor, because he really stages himself as as a civil servant who sits at his desk over his papers and cares for the state. And the interesting thing is that this ideal of correct, impartial, competent, and dutiful civil servant, Josephinist civil servant, is often explicitly evoked, especially in Austria, especially when cases of corruption of the government or in ministries turn up. So this is still there. The pictures are just examples, and I cannot really say how strong the influence of such symbols is in the practice and structure of civil service. But a more palpable and concrete case is the strong symbol of woman as mother, educator, and otherwise caring person. Why? What is the connection? We see how powerful it is when we look at the fields in which women were active in the civil service once they reached positions beyond subaltern clerical work. In the 1930s, for instance, when there were already a handful of women with university degrees in Austria, they were active in the administration of healthcare, education, and social welfare. So this is in some way quite gendered, I would say. The second subset of hers is that of normative concepts. How were they manifested in civil service? Which characteristics were assigned to women and men, respectively, in this context? Now, I would like to come back to the dissertation of Hans Nawiaski of 1902, of which I took the statistics we saw earlier, the numbers of women in civil service from the 1860s on. He was not only compiling statistics of women in state service, but also elaborating on their general aptitude for the task at hand. And okay, this is my very rough translation, and if it's hard to understand, that may be due to the quality of my translation, but the original is also a bit, interesting. Well, what he says about women is that they have a lack of understanding, for a higher notion of this position. And this goes beyond merely a correct fulfillment of the task conferred to them, but it demands a vivid feeling, a deep coalescence, this is very Josephinist in a way, with the weal and woe of the state as such. And he says, okay, maybe it's demanding a bit much to ask for this, even in very low positions. But he also says that the growing takeover of economic tasks by the state can only then get its full justification when its functionaries understand themselves down to the lowest position as organs of the collectivity and do not lose sight of the manifestation of public interest as the paramount goal of their activity. So he insinuates that women do not qualify as full civil servants because of this lack of the right consciousness. And he insists that such a consciousness must even be present in subaltern employees, but he never questions that male public employees have that consciousness. Yet in other incidents where we can find normative ideas and assignments according to gender are oath of office. In the texts of such oath, we often find explicit connections between maleness or masculinity and honor. I give you one quote, it's also in a bad translation of mine, by Thomas Stockinger. He's talking about the 1850s here, but bear with me, I will give you a bit younger examples in a minute. So he says, in an article about this oath in the Habsburg monarchy, that this oath, since the civil service was a male domain, the oath formulas explicitly linked honor and masculinity, and honor is a thing that is either not assigned to women at all or in other forms that have nothing to do with the state and state service. So he says that if this link is made, then it's connected with fulfilling a certain prestigious masculine role. Let's see what happens at the end of the monarchy, beginning of the Republic, where in Austria, German Austria, as it was first called, unlike in other successor states of the Habsburg monarchy, nationality was very, very important, and they were also very fast to come up with an ode to the Republic. And one of the earliest formulas for politicians and high civil servants was, in the name of the state German Austria, you will swear by your word as a man, by ihrer Mannesehre, by ihrem Manneswort, and by your honor as a citizen of the state to give, etc., etc. And in provincial archives, I also find versions of this oath for lower levels. And the most widespread formulation was, I vow as a man, citizen, and employee of the free state of German Austria, etc. And if there were female employees, they either signed the form no matter what. And at one point in the Carinthia provincial archive, I found, I vow as an employee, the female form, as eine Angestellte of the Free State of German Austria, but not as a woman and not as a citizen. So you see there is really a bit of a difference made. Right. As for normative concepts in disciplinary files, now we finally come to this, I would like to take a look or as questions of sexual morals. Extramarital sexual relations were not a disciplinary offense as such, but only when they became publicly known, when they caused a scandal. And such incidents then could threaten the reputation of the state. This was the case when one watchman was rumored to have an affair with two women who were mother and daughter on top of it all at the same time, and it was investigated. It turned then out that the affairs had not been at the same time, at least, but the problem was that the two women made big scenes for him in the street, and that was a scandal. Interestingly, that accused watchmen justified having these affairs with the fact that his wife, he was married, of course, was rather sick, and that doctors had advised to rather leave her alone. And so he was looking for sexual satisfaction elsewhere. The members of the disciplinary commission did not see this argument as valid, but I think just the fact that he came up with it in such a context says a lot about society and gender relations in it. Okay, right. Let's come to the next thing, the third subset, social institutions and organizations. I would like to pick marriage and family as social institutions as examples. And I would like to quote Hans Nawiaski again, where he expresses again fundamental, oh, where's that? Where is that? Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay, that was the watchman with the affair with two women, but I was talking about this now. Again, he questions the ability of women to work in this field for a special reason. The lack of consciousness among female employees is not just a transitory phenomenon, because when he wrote this dissertation, it was a new phenomenon, but there are also permanent reasons. And that's because women entering state service are already hoping that they will soon quit and get married, which is what they actually want. So they do not want to get in a closer relationship with matters of the state. They are not serious enough about it. And then again, once they've been trained and they are in the prime of their years, they lost for their workforce is lost for the state. So this is one of the points that he makes for against women in state service. Okay. Here we can recall the connection between work and family life and the marriage ban for women in public employment, because getting married equaled quitting the job until 1919, as said. Although during World War I, there were already exceptions to these rules. But for teachers who were employed not by the state, but by the federal provinces, in some more conservative provinces, especially the Western ones, Tyrol and so on, the marriage ban existed well into the 1930s. Yes, and another striking example here from 1919 onwards, as I said, men and women had equal pay for equal work and so on, and conditions of advancement were the same, but not all details had been taken into account. So if a widowed female civil servant died, her children could not receive an orphan's pension, as Käthe Leichter, a social activist and scientist, remarked in a publication of 1930. In disciplinary files of the 1920s and 30s, we find cases in which a male civil servant faced disciplinary procedures because not of something he had done, but something his family members had done. So here we have this one Inspector B has tolerated as a father and head of the family that the married mechanic so-and-so evidently had an adulterous relationship with the underage daughter. Again, scandalous scenes involving the public and so on. But here the idea is that it was his task as a head of the family to not let such things happen. And this does not only extend to children, but also to spouses. For instance, a postal employee, Karl F., neglected the custody and supervision of his wife. It has been his duty as head of the family in such a way that it was possible for her to be active for the then banned illegal National Socialist German Workers' Party by giving donations, obtaining illegal printed materials. She got a police fine for this. Yes. So she had donated money for the party and received printed brochures. The accused, Karl F., said, well, she has a job of her own. She works as a cashier in a cabaret in the Bonacher in Wien. and they have different work schedules, and they don't meet so often. So he doesn't actually know what she does all the time. And there was a disciplinary procedure, but he was he faced no disciplinary no. He was not punished for this. The disciplinary lawyer who argued against him protested against the first decision and demanded a reprimand, which is a rather mild but still a punishment. But he was that protest was not accepted. But we still see at this time, in the already late 1930s, there was a law or regulation stipulating that the head of the civil servant's family was in charge of what even his grown-up wife, who had her own income, was doing. And it was argued in the decision of the commission that it's harder to control women if they have their own income. So, and now for the last point about subjective identity. Of course, this is a very wide subject, and I will illustrate it just briefly with one example from a disciplinary files, in which the accused female civil servant explains and justifies her behavior also with regard to her understanding of gender relations. Mathilde F., a civil servant in postal services in Vienna, had shown up for work 5 minutes late. She had neither greeted the senior inspector in charge nor apologized for her delay. The inspector went on record saying, I've pointed out to her that she was obliged to show up for service in time, or at least apologize. And she answered that I was in no position to tell her anything. She was not a domestic servant. She was going to complain about me, and I could press charges against her as much as I like. That's what the inspector got on record with. Mathilde F. herself said that this inspector shouted at her, first you come late, then you are not greeting and not apologizing. And she said that in a loud shouting tone, whereupon I have answered that he should not shout, for I'm not his concierge. And also she said, she as a woman never greets a man first. She expects to be greeted. So this bickering and unfriendliness was not the main point in the disciplinary proceedings. It was rather about her being late and her disregard and displays of emotions also in service are negotiated in such incidences. As a disciplinary penalty, that's the word I was looking for, Mathilde F. was excluded from promotion for half a year. So herewith I'm coming to the end of my talk. I hope you could be with me until here. And as you have seen, the patriarchal setup of the civil service employment relationship is quite die hard, and despite developments and involvement of women, the values prevalent in society and also the legal framework underscore the breadwinner family still very much. Something must have changed in the meantime, for in Austria, one of the few areas where there is no gender pay gap is public service, but that's another story. Thank you very much for your attention.
And now I would like to open the discussion, and of course, also our guest online could ask. You can use the chat, or you can also directly ask to Therese. Martin?
If I have a question, I would love to ask. You were talking about women in civil service, and I wonder whether there were women in civil service in some managing positions or supervisory positions, and whether this posed a problem. Because from my experience in Czechoslovakia, also from 1919, the women could enter like these higher drafting service. They could get into decision-making positions, but I never encountered that they'd be appointed to some senior post, post they would lead actually the men during the interwar era. Whether this was problem an issue in Austria.
I know that particularly this problem was discussed in civil servants journals of the 19th century. That then this idea was completely new, and it was really said we cannot imagine that a woman supervising men. But I think in the course of the interwar period, like for instance these women of the 1930s that I mentioned, who were Gewerbeinspektoren or also trade inspectors and whatever, who had doctoral degrees and higher positions, they also supervised men. Yeah, but I don't know of discussions about this. I think it was rather the exception than the rule, but it existed. Yes. Yeah. Jana Osterkamp, thank you very much, and nice to well not see you. Could you please elaborate a bit whether and how female civil servants were active not only in Habsburg Vereine but also on a trans and international level? Well, on the one hand, I could better give this this question to Dora Ceferna, who is also present, or so I saw, who knows a lot about the exchange in between, for instance, Hungarian and Austrian activists. As for the international level, those big international umbrella organizations, the International Women's Congress and so on, and also the what was the name of the suffrage organization, also on the international level, formed just around that time, around the turn of 19th to 20th century, and only umbrella organization that represented a whole state could be members of this international umbrella organization, which was a bit difficult, for there could not be a Czech one, because it was part of the Cisleithanian half of the empire and so on. As for female civil servants, I mean, there is Auguste Fickert, for one, who was very, very active, who was a teacher. As for others, as far as I know, especially these active postal servant activists, I don't know so much about their international involvement, but there was one project of the more radical part of the organized civil servants, and that was a special housing project for professional women that provided not only living space but also communal kitchen and laundry facilities, and that was built in 1911 in Austria. It was not a big success because it turned then out to be too expensive. But what is transnational about it is that this model was also applied somewhere, I think in Transylvania. I would have to look it up. So yes, that's a lot of stammering now. I hope it's answered the question somehow, but I think the civil servants were not the most active on the international level. But Dora, of course, can correct me if she can say more about that. Okay, yeah. Christopher Wendt, hello. You mentioned the ban on married women persisting rather late into the interwar period. I was wondering about further difference regarding administrative cultures and gender norms that you may have seen in your research throughout the different provinces and federal states. How much was there unified Austrian culture? Huh. And how much can you see clear regional differences? Wow, that's a very interesting question. And I cannot see that I've come across something like this. No, an Austrian culture into. I mean, I've seen differences in those provinces that had a contested border, like Carinthia and Upper Austria, where there were more files of civil servants in the early years that insisted on being German enough to be included, but otherwise have not come across that, neither differences nor Austrian culture. But thank you still for the question.
Well, thank you for the presentation, and I have just a very small question. Does the sudden growth of women civil servants in the starting with the 1890s have anything to do with them being allowed to graduate the gymnasium? So are the gymnasium graduates going into the civil service, or is just a coincidence on the social and economic development background? Thank you.
No, I don't think that there is a connection, rather coincidence, and that is why that is because the positions in which women entered were on a lower level. I mean, they got training courses, for instance, for using the telegraph apparatuses and stuff like this, but it was mostly clerical work. So no, I don't think that there's a connection. Yeah.
Can I add the question? And the family origin was important in this connection. If maybe the father was also in work as civil servant.
Yes, very much so. I mean, what we know about the bourgeois women's movement of the last part of the 19th century, they were caring a lot for middle class women and girls for their education to get some employment, some livelihood before they hopefully get married. And there was the Frauenerwerbsverein. There was also a similar organization in Prague who organized training, especially for these lower middle class groups. So they were mostly from maybe a bit nobility, but more like a higher bourgeoisie, and they cared about the lower middle classes, and those were very often daughters of civil servants who got this training and who got into these positions. Yeah.
You mentioned the international organization fighting for female suffrage. So I was wondering if you have any evidence of these Austrian civil servants being involved in this movement, or maybe were they banned from these activities, or was there any rule regarding this kind of political activities in general?
They had to toe a certain line because political women were not admitted to political associations, and it's very interesting that the post employees alone had there were soon two main associations. I don't remember the name. One is Reichsverband, and the one other is oh, I don't remember. One that is more radical in a certain way, and one that is more more conservative, more asking for small small advances and trying to be on good terms with the bosses, and whereas the others were thinking more along the lines of were closer to the social democratic women's organization, although not part of it, and they would also argue for suffrage. But it was always dangerous, and there are also activists who lost their jobs because of their political activism. There's one very interesting diploma thesis in German LS about these two associations and their fights. But over the years, especially after 1910, then their issues converged to some extent, and then also the more conservative argued for women's suffrage. So yeah, sometimes it was also symbolic or just competition.
Because we have a similar case in Romania, and I want to know that we could find, for example, a state or private initiative in Austria to help orphan girls by giving them education and pursue an employee career.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I think it goes beyond the Habsburg monarchy. It was really a thing also in France and Britain at the time, in the last third of the 19th century. Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, you mentioned that there were 28% of unmarried men in the statistics, marital status of state officials. I mean, this might be also a minor question to Alice, because how does this correspond to a general trend in population? Because to me, it seems incredibly high, 28% of men being unmarried.
But they are unmarried in time when they were employment. Mm-hmm. So it depends on their age.
Yeah, but I would suppose that they entered, well, it's government employees.
I think that it is not necessary that they stayed employed.
But still, it seems to me it's rather.
No, we
observed something
we observed that the state civil servants really. I don't know the exact number, but maybe 10-15% of them real estate unmarried, so it was the higher percentage.
This is somewhat, I would say, impedes the argument that it was used that man is the breadwinner, that he needs to have a high salary because he has a family, he has to provide for his family members, while a third or maybe lower quarter of them have no family at all and don't need to provide for anybody.
That's a good point. But then again, if we look at the age distribution, I mean, I have no crossing of or combination of this data at all. But you see that the percentage of younger people is rather high, and since civil servants, as far as I know, got married rather in the late 20s, so maybe it has to do with this, because generally, I think,
Also, the civil servants often postponed their moment when they got married. So they really
some high position.
So I would like to thank you very much for a very interesting lecture, and to all of you for your questions, and hopefully we will meet again in some opportunity, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.